Hello, I'm Karina Lesser, Artistic Director of Scripps Presents, the public programming series at Scripps College, and I'm delighted to welcome you to a conversation with Fanny Singer and Ruth Reichl about Fanny's new memoir, Always Home. We're pleased to be presenting this program in partnership with Scripps College's Office of Parent Engagement and Philanthropy, and to help kick off Family Weekend 2022. Scripps Presents seeks to complement the dynamic humanities curriculum at the college by bringing the most thoughtful and timely writers, artists, and scholars into conversation with our community. We are committed to creating a forum for dialogue and reflection on the most critical issues of our times. This season, we're calling the food issue, and it's our chance to explore ideas around food justice, sustainability, and the evolving ways we cook and eat. Which brings us to tonight's guests, two forces whose writing and recipes are inspiring both our philosophical and practical approaches in the kitchen. Fanny Singer is a writer, editor, and co-founder of the design brand Permanent Collection. In 2013, she received a PhD on the subject of British pop artist Richard Hamilton's late work from the University of Cambridge. In 2015, she and her mother Alice Waters published My Pantry, which she also illustrated. Based in Los Angeles, she travels widely, contributing art reviews and culture writing to publications including Frieze, the Wall Street Journal magazine, Apartamento, Tea magazine, and Art Papers, among others. Of her book, Always Home, A Daughter's Recipes and Stories, Publishers Weekly writes, in this wondrous memoir cookbook hybrid, Singer's language is read out loud luscious, and her culinary coming-of-age story savory and sweet. Today, she's joined by the iconic writer and editor Ruth Reichl. Reichl is the author of My Kitchen Year, 136 Recipes That Saved My Life, a cookbook. She was editor-in-chief of Gourmet magazine from 1999 to 2009, and before that, the restaurant critic for both the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, where she was also named food editor. As co-owner of the Swallow restaurant from 1974 to 1977, she played part in the culinary revolution that took place in Berkeley, California. In the years that follow, she served as a restaurant critic for New West and California magazines. She's also a longtime Waters Singer family friend. Fanny, Ruth, welcome to the Scripps Presents virtual stage. We're so honored to have you.
Such a pleasure to be here. And it's always a pleasure to talk to Fanny.
The same goes for you, Ruth. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for that lovely introduction.
So you called your book Always Home, and it came out just as we were always home. Where did the name for the book come from?
It is pretty surreal, Ruth, that you and I were supposed to be speaking at the 92nd Street Y almost 2 years ago as part of the actual physical book launch. And now we are still always home. It's kind of like an insane thing to consider, but it makes the title feel that much more, I think, enduringly relevant. The book really was about kind of the idea of home in not a concrete way, but what does home symbolize to us and how we can recreate it wherever we are. So initially it was just called Home, and my editor was asking me for something just a little zingier, a little catchier than that. And it was my sort of honorary godfather, the humorist Calvin Trillin, who, when I was visiting him in New York, suggested adding an always in front of home. And I called him as soon as like the pandemic really kicked off and we were aware of just how prophetic the title would be. And I was like, I really owe you one for that, because I was like, I think a lot of people bought the book because they were like, is there a more relevant title for our times than this? Like, without even really exactly knowing what was in the book. So it really, I owe Calvin for that one.
Do you think that your book would have been different if you'd written it now or after this pandemic is over, if it's ever over?
That's a good question. Yes and no. I mean, I think the way I've started to think about home being quite literally in my house and back in my childhood home for the first 10 months of the pandemic, I was with my mom. And so it really gave me an opportunity to reflect on just like how true what I'd written was, and like whether it held up, because so many of the stories are about my relationship to my mom and our mutual relationship to food and the comfort that comes with that. And under the pressure of the pandemic, it was interesting to really scrutinize that relationship and see, whether I had represented it correctly in a way. And I think I had. So I think a lot of the writing still could have been the same. And especially because so many people found comfort in what might be described really loosely as like lessons from the book, little things like making yourself feel a little bit more at home by lighting a branch of rosemary and smelling something very sensuous that sort of transports you, and doing things like picking some wildflowers and making a little bouquet, these rituals which are described in the book. But it's about time probably to start working on a new book. So I'll get back to you on what that content might be.
Well, this is interesting because I did talk to you virtually when the book first came out, and you had just moved into your childhood home with your boyfriend. Why did you do that? What prompted you to move in with Alice?
Well, my boyfriend actually stayed, my now ex-boyfriend, I should add, he stayed in the apartment that we'd been in San Francisco because he was still working, and he was working from home, and it was a tiny 1-bedroom apartment. So my decision to go back to my mom's was so that there'd be enough space, but it was also because I was really worried kind of about her, and she lives alone, and her restaurant, Chez Panisse, had closed. And it had completely upended, her life and what her routines were. And I was sort of concerned chiefly about her, but then also it meant like getting to be back in this place under obviously very different conditions. But it led to this really interesting rediscovery of Berkeley that, even though it was a very tortured time and really, really, really painful for so many, it was this interestingly intimate and kind of beautiful reintroduction to where I was from. I spent more time walking around my hometown than I ever had in my entire childhood.
Yeah, and then you moved to LA.
When I moved to LA, yeah, I did. I moved to LA about a year ago. There was a certain moment actually where I was like, if I don't leave now, I will never leave. Like my mom and I will just be Grey Gardensing it, within 15 minutes, to like be wearing turbans. So it's like, I gotta go now. It's almost too comfortable. There was something, because she and I are so close, there was this sort of feeling of this could just go on forever if I don't do something that kind of changes the rhythm here. And so I did decide to move to LA.
So what is it like to make a home in a new place? I mean, you've never lived in LA before.
No, I hadn't. And in fact, like Northern Californians are taught this sort of, what you realize once you get to LA is this completely inappropriately sort of condescending attitude towards this southern city. There was always like an air of superiority, to the Bay Area. And so I'd never really considered LA, but because I write about art so much and I'm very much embedded in the art world, LA is really the city in California that has the densest and richest sort of arts ecosystem. So I was really interested in living in a place that actually had artists living in it. And that made the transition really easy because I had so many friends, and connections in that world and also in the culinary world in LA. So I felt kind of almost immediately at home there. But I am very adept at like settling in, so much so that when I got this little studio apartment that I have, I had friends come over and just say, it looks like you've lived here for years. It's like stacks of salad bowls and all of my art installed, within the first few days, and all of my, culinary collection arrayed everywhere in a manner that made it look like I really settled in instantaneously.
You think that's something you learned from your mom? Because one of the things that you write about so lovingly and humorously is how every time you went off with your parents and rented some house, that Alice made it so much her own that you said, we never ever got our deposit back.
That is accurate, and most definitely left an impression. I mean, I have the exact same tendencies. I walk into rooms and sort of immediately assess, like, what are the things that I want to change? And, that's, in the case of a place of my own, it's more immediately like, what will be the things, what's the kind of layout or cadence of this space and just thinking about like where art should go, or where, you would want a vase of flowers, or that the kinds of things that are part of my mother's set of considerations. But despite being kind of nomadic, because, I lived in England for 11 years and I was changing apartments or homes almost every year in that time because I was studying and then I was moving around a lot. I do have managed to hoard a lot of stuff. So despite like some peregrinations, I have quite a number of, things like antique brass spoons from Korea, and things like that. So almost immediately I was able to actually coming into my own place that was fully my own place. I was really able to set it up the way I hadn't really in years. I mean, I lived in either shared houses or with partners from the time I left, home when I was 18. So this was kind of the first time that I was like making a home fully on my own terms. Like, I'll have this here. No one can tell me I can't have that piece of art up or whatever it was. So it was really a pleasure actually to kind of settle into a place.
So how important is a kitchen to you in a home?
It's that, given my current situation, you would not think it was very important because I found like a tiny sort of 800 square foot studio. And it was designed by the modernist architect Rudolf Schindler in 1920.
Oh, you're in a Schindler home?
I am in a little Schindler apartment. It's one of the few apartment complexes he designed. So I think there are only like 2 or 3.
Oh, and his kitchens are terrible.
Tiny. Punishingly small. It's actually like the table that I'm currently sitting at is larger than my kitchen. It's a little pocket kitchen, but what it had that was really the selling point was a functioning fireplace. And it has this beautiful, like turquoise tiled sort of constructivist architecture. The whole place is really beautiful, but the fireplace works. So even though I could barely cook anything in the oven without setting the fire alarm off, I can cook in the fireplace, and it just is the cleanest draw. So I got a Tuscan grill, of course, almost immediately.
Of course.
And even though it's a studio apartment, which has no, divisions or doors, so I'm effectively grilling, in my bedroom. The fireplace is the redeeming feature. But I've lived in so many weird little spots over the years, and in England too, lots of really small kitchens and, graduate school dorm kitchens. And I always figured out how to cook under those conditions because I love to cook. And if you really love to cook, I think you just figure out how, whether you're chopping things at your desk instead of on the counter, if there's not a lot of counter space, or if you're using a hot plate because you don't have a good stove. Like, I've always figured out the sort of like MacGyver solutions when, the kitchen space itself is sort of subpar.
Well, I really want to talk about food and how important you think it is, because I feel like what your book is really about is what you call the reflexive conviviality of the table. And, that you sort of felt that your mother's way of bringing you up was to have people around all the time and sort of say, come for the chicken and stay to draw with the kid. And how that philosophy of the table sort of expands to a philosophy of family and of what constitutes a family, and why food is such a big part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely true. It's the sort of anchor, I think, of my own identity is food. And no matter how many other things I've sort of distracted myself with intellectually, there's still this core tether to this, it's not ideological. It's not even just sensuous. It's something else. It's all of those things, it's that, food is, as I always say, and it's sort of cheesy, but like food is the emotional communication that you do between people, or that it can be, that act of nourishing and loving someone through making something is the most sort of potent, I think, way of communicating. And why, even through my teenage years, when I was maybe a little bit more difficult, my mom and I never really had that vexed of a relationship, because I was getting this nonverbal communication. And so I use that too, it's like, it's my way of seducing friends into my, my sort of orbit. It's like, I want to meet an artist I'm really interested in. It's like, I ask them over for dinner, or a curator or writer, or someone that I am curious about. It's about how I expand a network, but it's also how I hold my closest even more dearly. And what you say, like, I create a kind of family through that, which is very much what my parents did. I mean, I didn't grow up with siblings, and I didn't see very many of their siblings who were dispersed all around. So we had all of this other kind of family that was really chosen family, and who were brought in through the magnetism of the table, which I think holds incredible power. I mean, I had a number of really interesting messages from strangers after the book was published, kind of asking me how to approximate the feeling of warmth and love and comfort that I had if they didn't themselves have that in their family unit itself, if they had difficult relationships with their parents. And I said, it's all about you can do it with chosen family. You can choose that family through the people that you love or seek out or interested in, and use that, like I said, the table as a kind of seduction to bring people in and to create that sense of closeness.
I mean, I think the thing that, there's so much about your book that is wonderful. I mean, the writing is gorgeous and sensual, and there's all this stuff about, paying attention to the smells and the sounds and the feels of things. But the thing that's most magical about it really is that you were raised like by a village, essentially, that it just seems to me the most ideal way to bring up a child, to have not just your parents, but to have this big group of people who become your family. And your family always traveled with other people, and it must be just such a feeling of safety to have all those people who are really rooted in your life.
I mean, the fact that, for instance, I'm living in LA now, and the person who I see the most and I call a godmother is this woman, Sue, who anyone who's read the book will know was Bob's partner when I was young. And I met Sue through Bob when I was 3. And before Bob was out of the closet, he was dating Sue, and Bob was my third parent. And so Sue kind of became my 4th parent. And she was always down on the floor drawing with me, or dressing up, or doing whatever, getting into little beds that I would make for her in the kitchen, while my mom was preparing food. And Sue lives 8 minutes away from me in LA. And so I see her all the time. And, it's like, I know that when I have kids, she'll be like a grandmother to my children. And that's such a gift of my mother's, in a way, almost compulsion to bring other people into her circle, into her table, was that it did create these very lasting bonds that then got passed on to me too. And which then, will in turn, I think, nurture my family and have become part of my other friendships. And it is the best kind of gift. I mean, and I think it's why I myself have that same sort of drive to bring people together. I've had in fact, the boyfriend that I ended up splitting from during the pandemic, he had not grown up like that. And so actually it was kind of jarring how often I wanted to bring people in, have people create dinners. And it was like, don't you get exhausted by that? He would say, and I was like, no, it energizes me. Like, this is the thing that gives me a sense of real life and purpose, is creating this dynamism around the table, having this additional sense of family, and the kind of indelible sense of closeness that really comes when you feed someone something delicious. It's like, it is one of the most intimate things you can do that is not sex, honestly.
Okay, I want to talk about the fact that you had a childhood without sugar, which is pretty astonishing. I mean, as a mother, I honestly don't know how your parents managed that, because there's sugar everywhere. But can you tell us, I don't know if you have the book there, but because I would love you to read it, but the passage about your discovery of sugar is so remarkable and speaks so much to what your parents' home was like. I mean, what their parenting was like. That it seems very important to me.
I'm staying at a friend's house currently in New York, so I don't have a copy of the book, but I know exactly which passage you mean. I remember, even though I was only 3 at the time, I remember, or just even, I'm not sure I was even 3, but I remember it because it was the most shocking, in the best way possible, experience to try ice cream for the first time. And we were in Italy, and I was allowed to have a scoop of ice cream, and I had this scoop of strawberry gelato that I can still sort of remember the taste of, because it was so potent. And it was at a time where I think too, ingredients were just so pure. It was in the 80s, and nothing was like, this was not a chain of gelato restaurants. It was like someone was really making it very carefully with like seasonal fruit. And the flavor was so distilled. And I don't think there's a better flavor of ice cream in a way. When strawberry ice cream is really good, it's just sings, it has that, the way sugar amplifies the flavor of the fruit. But I also had been deprived of sugar up to that point. Birthday cakes had been applesauce cakes sweetened with banana. There were things that my mom didn't really bake, which I think is partially why it was easier for her to kind of steer away from any.
But Lindsay sure didn't bring over tarts.
I mean, no, maybe there was the occasional sweet after age 3, but she really did keep sugar off my palate for a long time. And the result is that I honestly, obviously I ate sugar after that point. And there were certain sour candies I liked when I was in middle school and stuff like that. But my palate is been so savory that I don't really bake either. So my, if you could say that my palate now is a testament to whether or not that works, maybe, but I don't know, maybe it would have gone differently with another kid. But my mom's own palate is not a sweet palate. So I think there was some genetics in there. But, I don't know, she came up, in the 50s and 60s, she had a very strange kind of notion around some nutrition stuff. We only had non-fat milk, which we all know is just the devil's liquid. It's the worst taste. And no mom would really do that to a kid now, but she grew up around this idea of the backlash after the kind of bacon and egg breakfasts of her childhood was take all the fat out, all the saturated fat and cholesterol, and you had to have just non-fat yogurt and non-fat milk. So I grew up as a kid hating milk. There was some weird aberrations in our household that were under the sort of banner of health trends, The
other thing, I want to go back to this ice cream cone, because one of the things I love so much about your description of it in the book is that you're so taken with this ice cream that you smear it all over your face, and it drips.
Body. There are photographs of me.
And your parents just sit there watching it, because, which I think for most parents it would be hard to do, watching you, cover yourself in sticky goo, and they obviously just reveled in it, because. I suppose it's because your mom was a Montessori teacher, and she really does believe that the senses are a pathway to everything else. And I mean, they sort of describe them sitting there and just, enjoying the spectacle of you enjoying that ice cream cone.
I think too, and understanding that they were witnessing something that they really understood through their own experience, which is that food can have an ecstatic reaction or elicit one when it's really pure and really good and really delicious, and that then you have this transformative experience, which is also part of my mom's kind of pedagogy around Montessori. It's when these kids taste things at the edible schoolyard that they've never had before, which is her program in the public school system, where there's gardens and kitchen classrooms, and these kids who will have sworn off, any vegetable. And then once they grow kale and then they harvest it and prepare it and eat it in something delicious like a frittata, or they make kale chips and the kids eat it and their eyes almost bug out because they're trying something that they didn't actually believe was sort of a possible causality based on something that they reviled, is that transformation is part of a learning, a learning curve in a way, and also part of like the experience really of being human in its most, like its purest form. So yeah.
So your portrait of both your parents is so loving, but also so straightforward in a lot of ways. I mean, did either of your parents have any objections to anything you said in the book?
There were no objections. I mean, I think I definitely had to talk to my dad about the fact that even though he's present, he's not the focal point, because
you handled that beautifully. I really do.
And I felt like I owed him at least an explanation that this book wasn't just about my childhood. It was about a very specific, it only deals with food. There are not stories related to other subjects. So all the chapters are tethered to a specific recipe memory or a specific food memory. And so in a way too, then it doesn't allow me to be too sort of expository about, their lives or about my mom, specifics about my mom. So I think even though she felt like it was very intimate, she also felt like it was safe, that it was a very, there were limits to how sort of, how much I divulge in it, while at the same time being, like you said, really frank about a lot of it. It's not glossed over. But at one point my editor did say, like, Fanny, you do need to mention that your parents got a divorce. Like that has to, I mean, like it does have to be in there. And I was like, okay.
Yeah, no, it's very hard to write about living people and have them not end up angry at you. I know that from experience.
It is a burden on the nonfiction writer for sure.
So let's talk a little bit about the recipes. I mean, you chose to do the recipes in a very non-traditional way. Why?
To be very honest, I don't really cook very well from recipes myself or read them in a way that's accurate. I was trying to make muffins the other day, and I was 3/4 of the way into.
Oh, I saw your Instagram.
I was rubbing butter into flour, and I looked back at the recipe, and nowhere is there to rub the butter into the flour. I mean, like, I obviously don't bake very often, so it's especially bad at following baking directions. But that was this immediate, like, sensuous reflex. It's just like, start cutting. So I had to put the butter, like, and flour into the refrigerator and sort of figure out another thing to do with it. And then melted some more butter to put. And in that moment, I was like, this is such an exact reflection of how, like, I fail to kind of follow instruction when it's really, like, when there's a real programmatic kind of step-by-step, this much of this much of this. So I wanted to eschew that format because it's not an honest reflection of how I cook. But I also think so much of the book is about tapping into your sensuous and sensory world, and to respond with intuition and with an instinct to smell and taste and flavor. Actually, Ruth, I think it was something you said when we were speaking a while ago, where you said that your mother never tasted anything. She just knew that the recipe was right because she was smelling it. And she could tell she was sort of cooking by an olfactory sense as opposed to, like, necessarily tasting all the time. And I was like, that's how I cook in a way. I'm sort of gauging whether something is right by smells, and I'll taste ingredient before I add it, but I'll kind of have a sense of how it's going to come together. And I wanted people to start to trust themselves a little bit more, and start to cook in a way that is adapted to their tastes and their desires, and not necessarily feel like they needed to follow something to the letter. So I also, because it was, for me in my mind, it was, even though there are tons of recipes in the book, it wasn't really a recipe book. It was really more of a memoir. So I wanted the recipes to follow like additional stories and not so much like you jump just into a set of directions.
What's your favorite recipe in the book?
Okay, well, I think like the most revelatory recipe is the Green Goddess lobster rolls. But I love lobster. It's one of like these insane tastes that I developed at an all too precocious age. And so I would always ask for lobster, which I would eat very rarely, but I was allowed to have it on my birthday. And there was a year that my mom was going to make a Green Goddess salad, which is one of my favorite dressings, made this the way that Sir Shapenese makes, with mashed avocado and whisked aioli, and then with tons of herbs, tons of tarragon and basil and mint and everything in there. And she just had this inspiration to mix the lobster, which she'd shelled, with the Green Goddess and put that in the rolls. And it was like a crazy, brilliant move. And so it's how we always make them now. I mean, always. Whenever we make lobster rolls, we do toss them in Green Goddess. And I just feel like people who make that will be very, very happy with the result.
I think my favorite recipe in your book is probably the coming home pasta.
Yeah, that's definitely what people have made the most, for sure.
Which I would urge everybody who's watching this to go and look at the video of you and Alice making this together, because what's great about it is, one, it's about coming home to a kitchen you haven't used in a long time and reclaiming it. So it's not just about what you're ending up with. I mean, it's very simple, it's very delicious, but it's about putting moisture into the air, making your kitchen smell good again, getting the herbs. To me really is very much what your book is about, which is about how you make a home. So I love that you ended the book with that recipe.
I mean, you did just perfectly describe it, but I feel like a lot of people, I mean, that if you can say that any recipe from the book went viral, it was coming home pasta. And that happened during the pandemic, because there was a moment where it was really hard to find a lot of ingredients, and people were making this very spare pasta. It's very adaptable. You can use as many or as few kind of ingredients as you have. And so people were making this, but really feeling like they're making something tasty out of very little. And I do think that in a way that is also one of the sort of stories or themes of the book, is that it doesn't take a whole lot to feel yourself to be in a comfortable place or a beautiful place. It can take just a few candles. My mom always has beeswax candles in her purse, in case there's a place that needs like a little bit more ambient light.
It's such a great description. She always has some candles in her purse.
I mean, it's true though. And that's like, that those things they don't cost a lot of money. They're pretty low frill, but they can make a huge difference. Having, a jar of good anchovies in your pantry to, mince that with a little bit of garlic, and you have an instantly good pasta,
And then you sort of tantalizingly tease us with the Fanny Goes to College cookbook, which of course everybody who reads your book wants to see a copy of.
Someday I will definitely publish a facsimile edition. I feel like it's one of those things that like enough people, it had to be like later in my life, because there are already a number of the people who contributed recipes have since passed away. I mean, it was so many years ago. It was 20 years ago, which is crazy. But there are still recipes in there that I go to all the time. The best, not that I make carrot cake very often, but it is like the best carrot cake ever. And, Nilifer has a beautiful recipe in there. There are a few that are still touchstones. And you can see, because I took the actual, the original book to college, and there's just like fingerprints all over, like the fried chicken recipe from David Tanis, and Randall, his partner.
It's also such a great description of what life in your home was like, that, Fanny goes to college and your mother, calls up all her friends and says, will you send Fanny a recipe to take to college? And then, it gets illustrated and, I've never seen it, but it sounds incredible.
There was one recipe from a very dear friend who is a scientist. And actually, he's briefly spoken about in the chapter about Nilofer in my book, because Nilofer is married to David. But David gave me a recipe for the perfect snack to pull an all-nighter. And it was take a cup, any cup will do, pour some instant coffee into it, go to the bathroom, pour in some lukewarm water, mix it to a paste, eat that. And it was like, this will keep you up all night to get whatever work you need done. So there was, there is some real variety, both some humor, some legitimate recipes, some things for things like the perfect back scratch is in there as well.
Oh, perfect. And I don't think we can end this without getting you to talk about salad, because salad does show up on just about every page of your book.
Salad, my love. It's true. That was what maybe my mom figured out, that if she just plied me with enough delicious salad, that I wouldn't actually ask for any sweets, because there is certainly always a salad at the end of our meal. Every meal, really, we have salad with. So it was the thing that would finish right before we peeled any fruit or, had anything sweet from there was always a big bowl of beautiful fruit, whatever was in season. And my mom would peel, a pear or whatever. But before that was the salad. And I mean, that's the thing that the tradition that I carry forth the most into my own cooking is like, I don't think I go a day, even if I'm by myself, without at least a handful of leaves, My godmother and I have this tradition now of just having undressed leaves in a big, washed undressed leaves whenever we're on the plane, and just eat salad leaves while we're in flight. There's there's something very soothing about it for me, but also I love the ritual. I love the ritual of going to the farmer's market and selecting really beautiful lettuce. And the Hollywood farmer's market has incredible lettuce growers. And
yes, it does. The people at the very top.
Yeah, the garden. They're called the Garden of. Yeah, they're really wonderful.
Most beautiful lettuces.
Beautiful. So these and actually there's one called a pennies. So my mom always loves those. This beautiful flat sort of pale green one. And I get enough lettuce, for you'd think 40 people. And that's my lettuce for the week. And I do use a salad spinner. My mom doesn't really like salad spinner. So she will wash in a more traditional way and drain, and then put the lettuce in towels and roll them up and put them in the refrigerator. I do use the shortcut of the salad spinner, but I do love making the roll of lettuce on a clean towel, and it keeps the leaves really fresh and crisp before eating. And it's the thing that everyone associates my cooking with. They know if they're coming to my house, there'll be a huge salad, and probably a salad that's even larger than anyone really feels like they can handle. But it's definitely a trademark.
And do you always make the same dressing?
No, but there is a kind of classic one that I go to a lot, which is a little bit of a approximation of the Chez Panisse one, which is a pounded garlic clove, some Dijon mustard, and then a couple kinds of vinegar, usually a little red wine vinegar, and then also some Bagnols vinegar, which has a little sweetness. And then I always put lemon in there too, and sometimes some lemon zest, and then whisk in good olive oil. But I do love, actually really love putting a little bit of white miso into dressings. I find that that's a really delicious flavor. And I love anchovy dressings. I love chopping the Meyer lemon rind really finely and putting that into dressing. So there's a range.
Okay, last question. If there's one thing that you most hope people will take away from your book, what is it?
I think it's that thing that I touched on earlier, which is that you can really communicate through food, that you can describe the extent of your love for someone through how you cook for them. And it's because it is a kind of act of caretaking. And obviously it's also, of course, an act of nourishment, but how nourishing and how careful you are in the preparation and selection of ingredients, how you shop and think about the colors or think about the flavors, I think just tells the person who's on the receiving end so much about how you feel about them. And it's why I do, and I don't have children yet, but I know that there will be a lot of care put into things like lunches, which is something my mom spent so much time on, making sure I had a beautiful lunch every day for school until I left for college, really. And even then she came to Yale and started a garden and changed the dining program there because she was wanting me so much to have access to good food and good produce. And I understood how much she loved me and cared for me because of that, that she didn't have to tell me all the time, although she did, but it was more potent coming through the kitchen and onto the plate than it was even in other acts or communications. And so I don't know, I think that's something that it's not a disposable time of the day. I think it is really a time that when we ritualize it, it just pays dividends forward. I mean, we really reap so much of a sense of pleasure and home and connection through the time we spend together at the table.
Well, I could talk to you forever, but
well, likewise, track you down outside of this kind of format.
But this has really been a pleasure. It's a wonderful book, and it was wonderful talking to you.
Likewise, thank you.
I'll be in LA in a few weeks, so I hope I see you.
Yes, I would love that.
Thank you both so much. This has been so wonderful. There are so many moments I know I'm taking away. I love the idea of the table as seductress. Hollywood Farmers Market is definitely atop of the list. And as a mother of a 2-year-old, I can say that ice cream still prompts the same ecstatic reaction that you described. So thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation. We hope that we all get to spend time in person together and maybe come out to Scripps when the time is right. And for all of you watching, the Scripps Presents season has just begun. We have a number of other wonderful programs coming up, including Power Hungry, the Black Panthers, Freedom Summer, and the Fight to Feed a Movement. A program on the future of food with scientists who are rethinking your favorite sushi ingredients, and global foodie Yotam Ottolenghi. So I hope you'll join us. But for now, I hope everyone has a lovely evening. Take care.